So I'm going to get started. So at a previous talk that I had done, I had laid the biblical foundation for open source. And then the interesting thing is many people actually came to talk to me afterwards. And they wanted to know how to get involved. And they weren't just developers. These actually included designers as well. And many who were interested in sharing their work openly. And the interesting thing is that some of them had no idea what open source was, and they were excited. And some of them had already been started working on open source. But what became clear from that conversation is that a lot of people, their hearts were truly aligned with sharing openly, but the challenge was that they didn't really know how to do it, where to do it, or sometimes if there were organizations, even why they should actually do open source. And just a quick aside, my name is Christine Abernathy, and excited to be here at Missional AI to just take this conversation further. And the goal of this talk is to take the conversation beyond the why, and Jordan relayed a really good why and a vision casting, and into the more practical how. But before that, I'll just quickly dive into like the biblical foundation for open source. And open source is really well aligned with generous giving. And as Jordan said in his talk, it's like Acts 2 and 4. It's like textbook. And this is where believers shed everything in common. But beyond generosity, I just also want to highlight the fact that the Apostle Paul, he talked a lot about unity. And he described believers as being like different parts of one body, as one spirit in love. And I really like what Chris said earlier when he talked about this kingdom economy. And so when we think about like open source, and another thing that I really love, that Jesus in this discourse just before he went to the cross, he talked a lot about unity. And he said that people would know that we were his disciples by how we loved one another. And I always do believe that open source, when done really well, is a practical expression of that love. And it's shown in how we share with each other and then just lift everyone up. And for builders, this might mean that you're actually opening, sharing what you have so people can reuse it, remix it, and learn from it. And if you are an organization, it's sharing your work so that others can join in your work. You saw that example with Disciple Tools and with Gospel Ambition. And if you're a funder, it means that you can actually be generous with your resources and support open source projects that are actually powerfully and helping with kingdom work and kingdom impact. And in that way, these things that you're funding are being reused in different contexts so that you're not wasting resources. And when we're building silos, that's where wastage can happen. You're wasting time, you're wasting code, and you're duplicating previous work, and you're also preventing other people from growing and learning. And open source allows us to build better and to just build better in a way that you actually do better kingdom impact. Now, where does Christian open source landscape look like? I know Jordan shared a stat, and it kind of looked a little bleak, less than 5%, and he'd have it in red so we couldn't even miss it. But, compared to the rest of the secular world, it sometimes doesn't look that good. And what does it look like? So in late 2024, I just did a snapshot. I took as many open source projects I could find in GitHub and GitLab and a few other places. And based on this data, it was just interesting to see the types of projects that are actually being shared out there. At 10%, you got like Bible APIs, things like the free use Bible API, which is like a JSON text Bible API. You also had 10% church management software. You've got folks like Rock RMS, which is globally adopted and has been doing it for a while. Worship presentation software came in at about 16%. You've got things like OpenLLP, and they've been around for a long time. These are folks that have been doing open source for a while. Discipleship and community, disciple tools, if you were in the earlier talk, Jordan talked that quite a bit. And then at 36%, we've got education and Bible study tools, and that's actually a bunch of them. One example is And Bible. It's like an Android app for people to do Bible study applications. And the spread actually shows something pretty interesting. Like coming up at the top is like focuses on sharing God's word and some of the tools around that. And as you look at all of them, a lot of these are about how do you spiritually and practically actually support the church. But there's a big opportunity out there to do more in open source. So let's jump into how we can do that and do that really well by addressing some of the stakeholders in open source. And then generally, you've got contributors, and the contributors could be builders and organizations. I'll kind of like talk about what that means. And then we've got funders as well, and they're basically like supporting the open source work. And users and those who build on top of open source technology, and sometimes these users might contribute back, but sometimes they just like using open source technology, and even that might be good enough for some reason. But for the rest of this talk, I'm just going to focus on funders, builders, and also organizations. And so starting off with builders, these are like kind of like the heartbeat, and these are the ones who are just putting things together. So when you're saying about like how as a builder can you practice open source really well, I'm just going to think about like back in my time, because I've got a chance to work at, Jordan put up a slide with open source program offices, and I've had a chance to work at two of them. One was at well, it's Meta now, it was Facebook then, and then also at F5, and I'm more familiar with people who are tech builders, and I kind of think about why they actually do open source. And a lot of them are actually trying to solve problems that they personally face. Some of them are just showcasing and promoting their work. You've got builders who are also looking at reusing across different contexts. It's surprising to me, some people would open source things that I noticed at some point, and a few of them you'd sort of figure out that open sources and then they would leave the company, and that's because they actually wanted to use it in their next job. So that was like a roundabout way of sharing the code. And some of those folks were like using it to build community around some of the solutions that they had. So when I think about open sourcing and doing it well, what if we openly shared our work so that as believers, people could see us building technology together, because that's an opportunity to show us working together and be a witness to those around us by the way how we treat each other and how we treat those in the open source community. And even when you look at self-promotion, and somebody mentioned the word ego in some of the earlier talks, like that ego thing, what if we actually use our work not to promote ourselves, but actually to do something that gives glory to God? And I think that would be like a really cool way of doing open source in a different way than what the secular world thinks about it. But I do want to take a step back and think about, like, if you're thinking about building, sometimes it might mean that you don't even build at all. It's important not to reinvent the wheel. So sometimes when you're open sourcing it, you're like, okay, I just want to build something new because I just want to do it. But you may be able to actually take an existing solution as is, repurpose something that's already out there. And this is something that communities like Faith Tech with the Redemptive Framework actually have an exercise where they discern when you're building something, if and when you should build it at all. And so I think that's something practical as a builder that you should put in the back of your mind. But if you do decide to open source your work, then you also want to consider, if you're trying to practice well, is how are you going to support it? Especially if you're a solo maintainer, that can be difficult. And you also want to be clear about your capacity to support your projects and make this really clear. But support and open source is one of like the biggest things, because sustainability, as we'll see in a few slides, is actually really key. So some of the same most successful open source projects that I know actually tend to build a community around it, and the reason is to share the load, and this is a very biblical concept. And again, since I came more from the industry, I'm more familiar with those types of projects. And from my time at, say, Facebook and also at F5, there's one particular developer that I knew that was really like prolific. He would open source, or he would like start a lot of these open source projects. His name was Christopher Shadow. And he was like a key contributor at projects like React, React Native, Prettier. He was like, if people are developers, they might know that. He was one of those as well. And one time he did a side project called Excalidraw, which when he was bored, he just did Excalidraw. And the first thing he did was anybody who contributed immediately, he immediately gave them committer access. He's like, what? You gave them that much power? But that's because he wanted them to just come in and feel like a part of this. And literally about a year later, two of them actually started a company around that project, because that's kind of like the way he does. When he actually starts an open source project, he immediately sees, how can I empower other people to come and help me build with it and get out of the way and build a community around it. Another one that I'm just like not really familiar with this, but I was reading about Rock RMS, and it's just like shows how church software can actually thrive. And it was started by church IT director in 2014, and Life Church actually jumped in to kind of give support and to give resources as well. And they've actually built a really big community around it, and they're able to actually get like a sustainable funding model around it. And some churches donate money as well to help out companies who want to use it but maybe don't have the financial resources. So they're like a really good example of how you can actually thrive and use open source in the ministry. And again, there's like so many examples if you saw the earlier talk with Jordan that he actually pointed us as well. Now, if you were some of the things that, let's say you are a maintainer that I want to highlight, and some of the folks who already have done open source projects may already know this, but if you're open sourcing a project, these are some of the things that you want to think about when you are serving your community well. You want to make it really easy as possible for a first-time contributor to come in and actually get plugged in. It could be just creating clear documentation of how you can set up the project. It could be just giving people issue templates or pull requests, so when they're trying to figure out how do I report the bug, it makes it really easy for them to do so. You want to like label existing issues, so if somebody's a first-time contributor, or even if they want to know what do I want to work on, it's really clear. And when somebody comes in and actually gives you a change request or files a bug, you want to be as responsive as you can be. So basically it just goes to the heart of, I want to see if I can like treat everybody really well. You want to actively cultivate a community that feels, somebody can go in there and they feel safe and they feel respected. And some of the open source projects out there, they'll have something called a code of conduct. And even just that document being there and it's being enforceable is like goes a really long way to building a safe community. And keep in mind that conversations that are happening within your project, they're going to be happening in the open. And what a great way for people to actually witness if you treat people well, kind of like the love of God in how you serve. Because there's a lot of like not really nice things that sometimes happen in open source projects, and just we can be different. Another thing that would be really good is just being transparent when you're sharing the project's priorities and their roadmaps, and just keep people apprised of like what's going on and schedules. That's really, really important. Again, back in some of the experience that I've had, for about like 2 or 3 years, nobody knew what the React Native team was doing. This is like a mobile open source project, and the community started going off and just like plugging into like the vacuum what they thought was going on. So the community made, the lead maintainers made an effort to go in and start letting the community know what was going on, and it kind of led to a resurgence of the project as well. So really keep people up to date with what's going on. And you want to recognize and appreciate contributors, people who are jumping in and to help, but we all know at least like who you want to give glory and honor to, and it's to God. But how you do that, that's up to you. But this is something that would be really interesting to see in like kind of like Christian open source projects. And also, it's actually pretty nice to clearly tell people, how do I get from like this position to that position? For example, I could be just contributing by actually triaging bugs, but maybe I want to be like a lead maintainer. What's the process? Make that transparent. And finally, burnout. Burnout is a really big problem in popular open source projects. So I think there's some things that you can be thinking about even before you kind of get to that point. Demonstrate to others what Sabbath rest looks like. Steward yourself, just give you a chance. Make it clear to people when you're available, when you're not available. And you also want to automate processes as much as you can. And with AI and all, I'm sure you can do like a really good job of that as well. And lastly, you don't have to accept every change request that comes in. You can have boundaries and set boundaries as well. And you don't have to immediately set immediately accept a change request. I mean, I mentioned Christopher Shadow before. He would literally say within 5 minutes, he would respond to like an issue that came in. And this was a project this was like the React Native project, which was really popular at that time. But it's that kind of dedication that he would do. And that's why he would like very quickly bring people into the project, because he knew it wasn't sustainable. The other thing is that I've done quite a lot of sessions to letting people know how it is that you can actually go ahead and work on different projects, and how do you start your own. Basically, if you want to be a contributor to a project, you want to get involved in open source, this is some of the things that you can be thinking about. Begin contributing to existing projects before starting your own, just to kind of know what the open source workflow looks like. And you can start with documentation or small bug fixes. These are just ways to really get up and running. A lot of people, if you talk to people who are like really good project maintainers, they'll tell you the very first pull request that I made was a typo that I fixed. And they'll remember it to the day. Like, I even remember what that project was. So starting small is not a bad idea. And also contribute to a project that you care about, that you're passionate about, that you're familiar with, that you've been using, because you'll know what the project needs and what it needs to improve. And so I think it's like, I mean, that speaks to like, why don't we get involved in a lot more church projects, a lot more ministry projects. Also, a lot of projects will put together contribution guidelines. Go ahead and follow that guideline so that you know what that they expect. Things will be a lot smoother. And also, before starting any significant work, you want to make sure that you either file an issue or just comment on one that's already there, and just basically share what you're trying to do and how you propose to fix it. That goes a really long way. And again, if you get stuck, it's okay to ask. There might be some iffy communities, but most open source communities are really nice. And I think if we are building Christian open source projects, we have to be the gold standard. So looking forward to that. But the good news is that there are a lot of existing Christian open source projects. Besides the one that Jordan shared in its slides, there are Christian organizations that are actually building that you can actually get involved with. Disciple Tools, BiblioNexus, and Unfolding Words, they're creating Bible translation tools. AO Labs, they actually share the free use Bible API, but they're also building Bible experiences out there in the open. Gracious Tech, they're developing Bible components and a lot more. And Let's Copy Church, they're driving a movement to go beyond open source as code, but many different things. And you can find a long list of these in Faith Tools. They have a section for open source, and that's being updated, so you can go ahead and find out and get plugged in and start contributing. So next, I'm going to talk about organizations. And organizations, they're just builders and just like open source stakeholders. And there are different concerns that they might have from builders. So I'll just highlight some of them. But organizations, they typically struggle with how to get involved with open source. And here's a maturity model that you can consider if you're an organization. Typically, you want to start by using open source projects in your work. And sometimes, as Jordan said, a lot of things are built with open source, but sometimes people will choose proprietary over an open source. But if you want to build that muscle, you can start with actually using it. Then you can go ahead to like contributing to existing projects or the ones that you're actively using already. And then, think about starting your own. A lot of organizations don't go beyond one, which is okay. But if you go to 2 and 3, there's increasing levels of involvement, of expertise, of influence. And that's actually sometimes a really, really good thing, because then you can share your blessings and all of the things that you have learned. And in each one of these areas and these levels, there are different things that you can think about when it comes to open source. I won't go too much into using open source. That's more about just, pick open source projects that are well maintained, and there's like things that you can go and talk a lot about what that means. And secondly is just make sure that you're keeping your security up to date. So those are just like good hygiene topics. But when it comes to, let's say, another thing when you think about using is like, what's the cost of it? Because sometimes you can pick an open source project to use and then you realize, oh, I don't have anyone internally to help fix a bug or some of these different things. So just think about that, because if you don't have the technical resources and know-how internally, it might make sense to do proprietary. Or if you don't have commercial support for the open source, so just think about that if you're thinking about using open source. Now, what about contributing as an organization and doing it well? Well, the same things that I talked about for builders applies as organizations, but there's one that I want to talk about a little bit more, and this is if you actually want to start a new project. So the key decision is usually like what to open source and when to open source. And there's some things that you can be thinking about. Again, not every tech companies out there share everything they have. There could be reasons why it doesn't make sense. But sometimes we want to see if we can default to being more open. So before you make a decision to open source, you want to ask yourself, do I have the resources I need to support the community? Because it's really good to build in community. That's actually where the fruits of open source can come out of. And the second question is like, am I sharing something that is sort of my secret source or IP or competitive advantage? These are things that you want to think about. And the last thing is, the question is, could this project benefit others? So if it's not private IP or something that's really secret source, and you have the resources to support the community, why not try sharing? Because you want to build that muscle of sharing more with open source and being more open-handed, so why not just try it? Just the default should be open, and the best way to do that is just to go through this process and think about it more. But you know what? Open source does have a cost, and to plan for this, you could have a hybrid approach. Some people actually open source the software and then have like almost like a special paid features that people can use if they want or if they need some extra resources, because a lot of people do open source because they're really passionate about it, but you know, sometimes you have to eat. Well, you usually have to eat. So therefore, you want to think about like, how can I support myself through actually doing this with open source? And organizations have to think this a lot more than say an individual, because they usually have people that they're also working under. So that's one thing to consider. And sort of almost the last group of people that I want to talk to are funders, because they have a unique opportunity to support kingdom-focused open source initiatives. And they're like a key part of this whole piece. So if you're a funder, open source can actually be challenging, you know? Because impact is often hard to quantify, and that's whether or not you are the big company, like tech companies that you think have been doing open source for years, they struggle with actually like sometimes justifying, should I be doing open source? Ask anyone at Meta or Google who has been around open source. It's not always easy. And it's really sometimes an uphill battle to get these things shared, and it's probably the same issues going to show up in some of our Christian ministries. So we need to develop better ways to measure impact, to communicate that impact of open source, and even within our own Christian community. What is it doing for the community? What is it doing for growth? These are things that you can look at. It's not a solved problem, because people are still grappling with, but I would love to see a lot more research done in this area. I don't have the answers. The other thing that it's often with open source, I find that it's really sometimes hard to understand open source, especially if you are a little bit more non-technical. But the thing, even if you're non-technical, to remember is that even if that software and open sourcing, it's not that you're just funding and supporting code, but you really think about it as you're actually supporting collaboration and sharing kingdom impact. So I think that's one thing as a funder for you to just like think at the back of your mind. Another thing to remember is that when you are looking at the funding opportunities that are out there, open source might not be such an important thing in, say, some of the places like in the Western countries, where somebody can actually afford like a subscription to like some of these software. But when you're looking at places like, say, Africa, Asia, and some places like Latin America, which are growing really fast, they might not have enough money to actually pay for some of these subscriptions. So for them, open source isn't just like a nice to have. It could be just like their only option for some of the things that they are using. So if you think about it, as Christianity grows in those regions more and more, we would love to see more open source projects. In fact, maybe more open source projects would actually start there and make their way up to the global north. And an example is like, and even some of the features that people build when you're actually creating an open source project is think about some of those areas where you can be building for. I had mentioned this project called AndBible. It was an Android app. They actually have an offline capability specifically because of the regions where it's being used. And that just basically grew the use because it was actually solving a need in some of those regions. Another thing is that when you're looking at AI, this is where you've got closed source and you got open source models and all of those different features. And you see how it plays out in the world today. Today you got Llama, today you got OpenAI. It's just like, it's always like a race. Who's far behind? How many months behind are there? But when you're thinking about it, with open source and AI, funders might have like an outsized ability to actually drive positive change, because you can think about how can you support open data sets, open models, open information. And if used really wisely, and this has probably been said over and over and over at this conference, it can really help the church's mission. And I believe that the key is to keep AI as a tool that serves the users and not the other way around. Because I think by working together and using these AI tools, and especially sharing them out openly, we can actually make it available to all churches, and we can inject some of our values in there. And these are values that we all know: generosity, just loving each other, and then just standing for the truth. And these can done really well in open source with some of the features that Jordan mentioned, transparency, etc. And I think this is an area where the community can actually have more conversations around this. So as a funder, when you're thinking about this, these are some things that you can think about around sustainability. And these are the funding models that are out there. You've got donation-based models, and these where projects that rely on donation or grants to actually work and to benefit the work. And sometimes you got that church management systems. Sometimes their attendees can pay a little bit of a fee. And that's a good model for a funding model. Another one is a ministry subsidization. And what happens here is ministries might allocate a part of their budget and say, we are actually going to have some folks work on some technology, and we're going to release that as open source. And that's a good way to fund it. And that's like a small way of like companies like Facebook and Meta and Google and all, that's what they do. They've got some people specifically working on open source for different reasons. There's freemium and service models where I can open source something and then have people do paid features, or I can have some service and help them make things less complicated by giving them like cloud services on top of that. That's another way that you can actually fund open source. And institutional adoption. Sometimes you've got denominations that can come in and adopt open source and indirectly fund it. So basically, they're almost like treating it as shared infrastructure. So these are funding models that you can use. But if you're thinking about funding a project as a funder, what should you be thinking about? Here are some things that you can be thinking about. You know, it's really good to, if you want to fund a particular project or a company, see what they're doing within open source. What are their contribution plans? And try to kind of maybe have a little bit of pressure to say, why don't you do a little bit more open source? And that might actually help. I'll fund you if you do open source. I know. But anyway. Another thing that's really important, and I heard some conversation, is what about creating a clearinghouse where you can see all of the projects that are being funded, a directory of kingdom-focused open source projects, and so that without too much friction, funders can come in and see what kind of like, what's available, how are people doing it. There's something called Open Collective. If those people who are familiar with open source, is a place where somebody can come and say, I'd love to get funded. Something like that, potentially use that, or something like that would be pretty useful within the Christian context. And it'd be really good to prioritize and fund projects that are being used in different contexts, because you know that if they're being used in different contexts, then it's a multiplying effect. And look for transparency. Projects that are doing all their work in the open is really key. And the last thing I want to talk about is the ecosystem. I just feel like this actually pulls everything together. This is the spirit. This is the body working together. And if you're familiar with the open source ecosystem, this is just like a kind of like a flavor of some of the things that go in, say, in an open source projects. An open source project is not just the developer working on the code. It is the software developer potentially working on the code. It's the documentation writers who explain things, the content creators who produce the media, designers who drive best practices, designers who drive the user experiences where it looks really good. You've got developer advocates who promote the project, community managers who bring people together, the users who provide the valuable feedback, and the funders who support the work financially. This is everyone who makes this successful. Sometimes if you're a solo maintainer, you might be doing all of that, but you just want more people to come in and help you. And this directly reflects basically the body of Christ, where the Spirit is giving unique gifts to people, each of them to do one thing really well, or many things really well. But when you develop code, manage all these communities and all of this, you do have a valuable role. And as Paul taught, even the seemingly least important part of this whole body is very important. It works together really well. And to that end, that's part of like what we want. We would love to see believers coming together, discussing what are all the things that are missing, because I may have left you with more questions than answers. Like, what are the frameworks, what are the support systems that are specific to the Christian context that we can actually be building together? And Jordan put a slide with lots of little boxes of the open source program office. And there was like a talk openly, develop openly, kind of like a community of practice that was started way back that I was a part of. And it grew from like a handful of people to almost like maybe 100 or more. And what they did is come together and talk about, what problem are you facing? Oh, maybe I can help you here. And even some of those who were competitors were able to work together. So I think this is something that we need, where we can support each other, share resources, and develop success. And I think this is something we've been praying over since 2024. We love you for you to kind of get involved and join in. And I think open source provides a powerful model for kingdom collaboration. By sharing our work openly, we can demonstrate unity, steward our resources wisely, and multiply our impact. So just like the miracle of the loaves and fish, you know what? We can bring whatever we have. Design, documentation, and I think God can take those offerings and multiply beyond what we would do alone. So no matter who you are, I think there's a role for you. So I invite you to join this discussion, this conversation. Be part of Openly Faithful, drive your own initiative, contribute to open source, initiatives that advance the Great Commissions. I know, let's bring what we have, your loaves, my fish, your loaves, your fish, trusting that together we can actually build together technology that glorifies God and actually serves the world and the Great Commission. So I thank you so much.